record, and we are reading Plato, Twilight 2020, Session 5, The Absolute Reality of Forms. All right, so this week we're going to start again with looking at the kind of the exercise stuff we did before we get into the reading itself. So we'll do that, and then we'll do a bit of a revision of what we did last week because it was quite intense, I think. And then we'll move into this week's reading. And I'm really glad to hear that some people got through it and even enjoyed it. So I think you must be getting used to reading Plato. I mean, it does take a while, and so that's certainly a good sign. Okay, so I'm going to put on the share screen here so you can see a few visuals, which is always helpful. And we'll kind of, again, we'll go through a bit of what we did last time, and move through to some new material. Okay, so here we go. So remember when we started with my cup, and so sensible, and we came to the conclusion that sensible objects are in my experience, in me. You know, that was my conclusion. You might come to the same conclusion. All my sensations of the cup are in my senses, in me. Nothing I know of the cup is beyond my sensations. I construct the cup in my mind, in me. This doesn't make sense in some ways, you know, if it's all in me, because the cup seems to be independent from me, and you also seem to see my cup. So we're really looking here to find the foundations of knowledge. What is the foundations of our knowledge? And this is kind of a basic process that you go through in philosophy. And as I've noted before, you know, like Descartes went through a similar process with his meditations. And I also mentioned Bertrand Russell has a good book about that as well, which is up on the website. Now, another way to try to find the foundations of what we know, at least from a linguistic point of view, is looking for the definition of words. Now, remember we started looking for the definition, and I think Paul gave us an amazing definition of cup, which I remember it had device in it. That was good. So you get the word cup, and you say, okay, what does cup mean? It means device for drinking or whatever, or a container or something else, but you just come up with other words, and then those words needed to be defined and defined and defined again in the language, and they are defined in our language, in English. So you can go from word to definition, but they're just other words, and you get definitions of them and you get other words. So there's no ground for knowledge there. Okay, and so then we talked about last week about signs. So we're talking about in terms of the notion of what a sign is. So we talked about words. The cup signifies its meaning, in this case, other words. And we talked about letters signifying the sound, like p or r or whatever it is, in whatever language it is, whatever system it is. And we talked about the sign of green on the traffic light means go. And one of the first things we observed about this is that these signs, as defined in this way, are arbitrary. You know, you could use another word for cup in another language, or you could have a code for cup, or you could use another color to signify go. Okay, so the relationship between the signifier, if you like, the P and the sound P, the relationship between the signifier and the signified is arbitrary with words. And then the other thing we recognize is that if we think of words and meanings as in this relationship, then the signification just goes on and on from word to meaning, and so forth. And so that's how we can see it. And that's how a lot of people in philosophy kind of get to a position of skepticism, that if they think of that philosophy is linguistically grounded, if our knowledge is linguistically grounded, then there's no way of escaping it. There's no way of getting to a proper ground beyond language. So that leads to a skepticism. And a lot of modern skeptics think in this way. If you've heard of postmodernism and deconstruction, modern philosophy, then the skepticism is focusing very much on signs and seeing that we can't really go beyond signs. Okay. But next we want to consider symbols, right? And so we talked about signs is a bit confusing. We talked about the sign telling you about the kangaroo, or the sign telling you that you can walk. And we're just looking at these signs particularly because they are symbolic in the sense that there's a non-arbitrary relationship between the symbol and what it symbolizes. So the kangaroo, it's not a word, or it's actually the shape of the kangaroo, and then the green man, or whatever we call it, the walking man, is in the shape of the man. And so representational art is like this. So you have a portrait, it resembles, right, the person being portrayed. And the image I see of you on the screen, it's a two-dimensional resemblance of you yourself. Okay, so it's a non-arbitrary relationship, and that's how I distinguish between the symbol for you on my screen, or image of you on my screen, and the image of someone else. I know that they're different. So because of this resemblance, which is different from the signification. Okay, so remember, it's green for go, but it could be something else. So that's sign, and a representational art and symbols are different than that. And so why we're getting to this is because it's kind of like a segue into thinking about number. Because remember, the Pythagoreans and the Platonists said the essence of things is like the essence of number. So if you understand the essence of number, then you might understand the essence of things. So we did ask, what is 2? And where is 2? I mean, what is it in its essence? And remember we said last week, well, let me show you. I can show you 2. Is that enough? Here's 2 fires, here's 2 just marks, right? Now I've got my 2, if you like, yellow eggs there. And these are all examples of 2. Examples, expressions, the statues of justice. And I would say each of them expresses 2. In Plato, it translates usually as partakes or participates in 2-ness. So the 2 things partake in 2-ness in a non-arbitrary way, kind of like your symbols there. But 2 itself is insensible. It can only be shown by example. You can recognize 2 without defining it or proving it. It's not about defining it, like getting the exact definition as we're trying to do with the cup, or proving it in somehow saying, well, this is my proof of 2. And many people have tried to do that in philosophy and got into very embarrassing tangles. But we don't have to get into those embarrassing tangles at all. It's just a showing, not saying. Do you see what I mean? Do you see what I mean? That's what 2 is. That's an example of 2. It's not 2 itself, but that's how 2 is expressed in our sensible world. Okay. So 2 itself is conceptual, insensible, but I can show it by examples. Do you see what I mean? Do you see what 2 is? In a similar way, non-geometric forms like justice, beauty, and equality can be shown by likenesses using examples or analogies. So if we extend this a little bit, Plato's saying that, well, okay, this is what's going on with these other basic things, these concepts, right, of justice. You know, what is justice? We're trying to find out what is justice, what is beauty, what is good. It's a similar sort of thing going on. Okay, so then you get down to something more elementary. Remember, we're asking what is two, but what is one, right? This is where it gets to the most elementary thing, because you think about it, everything is one. Everything where you say the cup or the pencil, right? Every concept, the concept of justice is one. It's one in itself. That's a concept. It's different from the concept of beauty. So what is this formal one that is everywhere? For Plato, one thing partakes in oneness in a non-arbitrary way. You can recognize one without defining it or proving it. It's showing, not saying. Do you see what I mean by one? Well, we do here, don't we? So then we're in Platonism, we move to a bit more of an idea of this one. And so we would think, well, you know, the one's pretty straightforward, right? Well, it is. It is pretty straightforward, but we would argue, the Platonists would argue, that we haven't paid proper attention to what one actually is. And so I think last week I introduced this analogy, this allegory, this analogy of the form of one in Plato. Okay, so one as an opposite, and we use the analogy of the island and the sea. And so if you imagine you have a globe, the earth, and there's a single island in just a sea, a very simple idea of the earth, with one island and then the sea around it. So I haven't really drawn that as a sphere here, but that's a better one to imagine because there's no limits, because you can see here on this, in here, I've got a limit here and a limit here, but we want to start with an idea where it's a complete unity in itself. You've got a sphere and you draw a circle on it. You have inside and outside. And here the inside and the outside is island and sea. It's 3 in 1. The shore distinguishes between island and sea. It's like a same other difference. And it has a differential value. So when I say island, right, I mean island, not sea, right? I might say sea, I mean sea, not island, okay? Or it might be justice, not injustice. I might be defining or thinking about injustice as opposed to justice. So one of them's brought forward. And I think I said last week, it's like foreground and background. For island, island's in the foreground. For sea, sea might be in the foreground, okay? So they are opposites. There's two forms that are opposites. In island, it's not sea. Sea's in the background. In sea, it's sea, not island. So in each case, there's 3 parts, and the 3 parts can't exist without each other. So it's good to think about how would you remove one and still have the others. Okay, so in Plato, that is analogy for the form of the one. Okay. Now, we can express this in different ways and use different analogies, but obviously if we want to talk about the one, we can talk about it, we can use that actual word. So here we're using geometry to make a distinction of one thing from its negation, one not one, in the same form. And we can also talk about same other, and this will come up in Plato as well, where you have the same, the thing, the island, and its other, the sea. So it's where you have these 2 opposites and one is brought forward, one is the foreground. Okay, that's probably it. And, you know, there's an example of just, unjust. 3 in 1, the distinction between inside and outside. The unity of the form is in the distinction. So when you're defining justice, you need to distinguish it from injustice, or just, unjust. Okay, I think that'll probably do for today. Okay. All right, I'm going to stop the share And we're back. So yeah, how is that? It's kind of like, one of the things I should say about this is like some of the problems people have with this stuff is that they think it's sophisticated, right? It's complicated, but the actual difficulty with it is its simplicity, its elementary nature. Plato's trying to point to something that is so simple that we don't pay attention to it. So that's what we're trying to focus on here, this very simplicity of this elementary basis of our knowledge, of our perception, and of really everything we know. All right, so before we go back onto the Phaedo again and get stuck into that, has anyone got any questions or reflections or comments?
I've thought of something simple, but I don't know if it's similar. But I've thought before about these opposites, but I've thought of it more in a sense of like where you've got happiness or you've got sorrow or joy, and I've thought of it in that context. That you've got to experience, you've got to have both, because how do you know what joy is if you haven't had sorrow or sadness? And I don't know if I understand in forms what opposites mean to each other, but I don't know if that's in the same line of what he was talking about. Whether these are just the feelings or
no, this is very much what he's talking about. And Kathy, you'll remember that we started our very first reading of the Phaedo with pleasure and pain, and it's a similar sort of thing. How, like, think about it, because first you think, well, of course you could feel pleasure without knowing what its opposite is, what is not pleasure. Maybe it's not. Maybe the opposite is not pain, but let's just say not pleasure. How can you know pleasure without knowing not pleasure? You might be having so-called pleasure all the time and not know it. Think about that. Saint Augustine, who was a Platonist, had some wonderful things about this, where he was talking about, he was trying to impose Platonism on the Jewish creation in Genesis. I was just thinking about this because we did Platonism and Christianity last night, and he says, oh, like he created light, but notice that God didn't say let there be dark, right? He just said, let there be light. And so, what he was saying is that actually before there was light, there was no darkness, right? Because there wasn't a distinction between darkness and light. And then when he said, let there be light, darkness was generated as its opposite. So think about that one, that in a way, when you make a distinction, when you start thinking about, okay, there's maybe a new concept you're trying to come to terms with, you're defining it in terms of its opposite. Its opposite comes as the background. When you have an image, the image of the kangaroo, right? I think it was white on a black background. You can't have the white on white. You need to have the white on the background. It needs to be drawn out of a background. So you need to, in a way, the two are created at the same time. Okay, anyone else on that? All right. Are we ready for Phaedo then? Ray. Okay. All right, I'll do a little bit of a recap first, and then we'll get into it. Oh, it's I read through this and I just think, oh, I don't know what you guys think of Plato when you read through this, but anyway. So the argument for the immortality of the soul continues. Socrates has explained that philosophy is a preparation for death. But how do we know that the soul survives death? And if it does survive, not just survive as smoke scattering or breath scattering, it survives in some sort of, uniform way. And then he abruptly introduced this generation from opposites. In this generation, there are these two processes, like he said, awake to sleep and sleep to awake. You wake up and you go to sleep, right? In the same way, if there is life to death, then there must be death to life. So the soul is reborn. Now, in this generation, it's actually quite interesting. And if you read more Plato, you get into it a bit more. And we can talk about it later. But you can think of it as this binary opposites, and that this elementary generation is moving from one opposite to the other, just as we've been talking about. So you could think of it like a pendulum, or like going from the left foot to the right foot, or going from zero, or from one to nothing and back to one again. It's a formal principle of change using the minimal form of difference, which we mentioned last week. And if you want to discuss it more, we can discuss it in the break later. Okay, so he next introduces the argument of learning as remembering, which we had quite a bit of a discussion about last week. The soul of the baby remembers what it knew from birth. So it must have existed before birth. Where does the idea of justice, of beauty, of good, of equality come from? Where do the ideas of geometry and arithmetic come from? Remember the story of Socrates questioning the slave boy. He got the boy to solve the geometric problem of the doubling of the square without teaching him anything, only by guiding him to remember what he already knew. That was the claim. More simply, the circle, the number 2. How do we come to them? We know them already, but we have forgotten them. Our sensible experience reminds us of what we already knew. So this is learning as remembering. What the baby recalls are the forms of things, but from where and when are they recalled? Well, Socrates' answer there is from their past lives. And this is his argument. This is part of his argument for the immortality of the soul. So now there is one special form introduced here, which we also discussed last week, the form of equal, unequal, same or different. The likeness of two things, two pens, two cups, or whatever, involves their sameness, their two pens, their difference, maybe their different colors. Anyway, we can break it all down to in what way they are equal and in what way they are unequal. And this points towards the idea that underlying all likenesses is the form of equality and inequality, sameness and difference. So finally, last week, we got to the argument by affinity for the immortality of the soul. The soul has the same characteristics as the forms. It is united, invisible, insensible. Therefore, it belongs in the realm of the forms, which are eternal, and so the soul is eternal. So there's his argument. Now, remember we finished on that famous quote about the soul when it's alone, wanting to journey into be with the forms where it belongs. And this is important here because it introduces to us Plato's two realms. And if you do more Plato, this will become important. This will be at the background of a lot of what you do. And so, you know, we've already kind of got there, really. I mean, the first realm is the realm of the forms in themselves, two in itself. And then the other realm is the sensible expressions of the forms. So this realm of the forms in the Republic, anyway, is usually translated as the realm of the intelligible, the intelligibles, right? And that's often the translation into English. But people these days, Platonists these days, often just derive from nous, from the word that's used in the Greek, and say that it is the noetic realm. And we might use that. So the realm of the forms is the noetic realm, okay? And then there's the sensible realm, the realm of their expression. So the realm of the forms is also called the realm of the being, That's where being resides, the essence of all being. It's unchanging, it's divine. And then the world of sensible things, which is changing all the time, that's the world of becoming, the world of change. Okay, so getting some idea about that from what we've already done with forms and with numbers and with circles and the ideal circle and two itself and all that. Think about that in terms of these two realms. And what's important, of course, is to see the link between them. You know, most people who come to Plato don't understand that, and it's not really normally taught. But I think, yeah, we can maybe see that at least through the way we were talking about the number 2 and the number 1 today. So I could stop there if anyone's got any pressing questions, or move right on with the Phaedo. So anyone want to just throw something in there, or we keep going? Okay. All right. So there's a small gap in the reading here. I don't know whether anyone read this, but if anyone's interested in pre-Christian stories of the afterlife, then this is a good section to go back and read. So around page 80 to 85 contains a lot of stuff about afterlife, about reward and punishment, and remember how we were talking about the philosophical practice of detachment, how the practice of philosophy is to detach yourself from attachment to sensible things. It's not that you don't participate in the world of the sensible and in society and all that sort of thing, but you have this philosophical attitude of detachment from sensible things and from the passions and those concerns. Now, if in this story that we get here, if the soul is completely detached from the body, it will go more easily into the next world and will be rewarded. If not detached, then the soul will remain partially visible, like souls can be seen hanging around as ghosts in graveyards. Okay, and then there's this discussion here of one's reincarnation, and that you're reincarnated, so you come back into the world appropriate to the way you previously lived. So we're reincarnated according to our habits. So gluttons and drunkards are reincarnated as asses, and tyrants and robbers become wolves and hawks and kites. Only the philosophers go up and commune with the good gods. Now, a lot of people read this section and point out similarities with Buddhism, with Buddhist samsara, the life-death cycle through bodies. The soul is reborn again and again into bodily life, a cycle of imprisonment until it is purified through philosophy, until it is ready for a life in the noetic realm. So, which might be seen as similar to the Buddhist nirvana. Okay, so this brings us to our reading. These stories of the afterlife are all very wonderful, but then there are two objections reluctantly spoken. So Simmias and Cebes have these objections, but they don't want to really raise them with Socrates, considering his delicate situation. Our objections are disagreeable to you in your present misfortune, Socrates. The sun is getting lower, and so the question of the afterlife is rather pertinent for Socrates at his present time. My situation is not a misfortune, says Socrates. Are you suggesting that my prophetic powers are less than the swan who sings with joy when it's about to die? The swan song. So reluctantly, Simmias and Cebes put their two objections. Now we'll come to these in a minute, because wait, there's an interruption. there's an interruption to the telling of the story. I don't know whether you picked this up, but we're going back out into the framing narrative. Epicrates interrupts the telling. Now, so what's happened here is Phaedo, who's telling the story of Socrates' last day, says he remembers that they were all very uncomfortable in the prison cell when they heard these objections. They'd all previously thoroughly convinced by Socrates' argument, and now it was thrown into doubt. Now remember that Epicrates had chased down Phaedo to tell the story that we're now following. Well, now he interrupts Phaedo, the storyteller, at this point with concerns about the relationship between argument and truth. So we're stepping away from this particular argument and saying, well, what does this mean about argument and truth? Previously, we had seen the character of Socrates use argument in a skeptical way, but that was in like Euthyphro. But notice here in Phaedo, he is using it to build up a positive case, whether we agree with it or not. And this is the nature of the challenge here. Socrates has been using argument to develop the ideas, his ideas about immortalities, but Epicrates says that he was totally convinced before by that argument, but now he finds the challenges by Simmias and Cebes very persuasive. What argument shall we believe henceforth? Socrates' argument has fallen into discredit. Now, so we get an answer from Socrates within the story when Phaedo goes back to the story. It's because folks make bad arguments again and again that one tends to become completely skeptical or reject altogether the method of discourse. Now we're talking here about logos, translated as discursive reasoning, right? And Socrates is using logos, discursive reasoning, to try to bring him to the truth. But this has been brought into doubt. And Socrates is saying, well, you know, you hear bad arguments all the time, and you have you put argument in too high esteem, and then you become a hater of all argument, and you become entirely skeptical. So Socrates draws an analogy between misanthropy, the hating of people, which comes from disappointment at heightened expectations of what people should be like. And likewise, misology, the hatred of argument, comes from disappointment at heightened confidence in the truth, that the way argument can deliver truth. This leads to skepticism of all argument. Socrates says that argument should not be abandoned, but that a sound argument, but you need to find a sound argument leading to truth. But it requires the right disposition. However, Socrates himself is not in the right disposition. So we are back to sophis and sophistry, where the interest is not in finding the truth, but only in winning the argument, and so in persuading the hearer to see, is persuading the hearer to what seems to be true. Is this what Socrates has done so far? Actually, Socrates says, of paramount import to me is what seems to be true to myself. He actually says this. If he can convince himself, even if it's not true, then my soul will not die, then he ain't to know better. And he spared the rest of them his lamentations over his dying. Indeed, Socrates confesses that he is most definitely in a position of interest in terms of the argument for immortality. And I'll read you a bit from this passage here. It's around 91a or 90e. We must not let it enter our minds that there may be no health in argument. On the contrary, we should recognize that we ourselves are still intellectual invalids, but that we must brace ourselves and do our best to become healthy, you and the others, with a view to the rest of your life too, but in my case, in view of my death itself. Because at the moment, I might easily handle this argument like a competitor instead of a philosopher. You know how, in an argument, people who have no real education care nothing for the facts of the case and are only anxious to get their point of view accepted by the audience. Well, I feel that at my present moment, I am nearly as bad as they are. So, what's he saying? We can come back to that in the discussion later. What is that all about? Okay, so now we'll come to the two objections. Cebes and Simmias use analogies to make their objections. So Simmias says, perhaps the soul is like the harmony of a lyre, like a guitar or something, a stringed instrument. When the lyre corrupts or breaks, there's no harmony. The soul, now this is like the soul is, I say, an epiphenomenon of the body. The soul is something that is dependent on the body. And this is the normal materialist atheistic view, right? The soul is reducible to the mind, which is reducible to the brain. Squash the brain, and the intellect is gone, and the soul is gone. Okay, so that's the first argument, that it's like the lyre. You have the harmony, break the lyre, and there's no more harmony. Break the brain, and there's no more soul. So Cebes uses an analogy where the soul-body relation is like a weaver and his coat. The weaver outwears many coats, but eventually he dies. So he, generally speaking, outlives a body, but it's not immortal. The soul's not immortal. One time when you die in body, you will also die in soul, but you'll never know. So the soul might live longer, but not necessarily be immortal. Okay, so now Socrates addresses these arguments. So firstly, on the harmony argument, Socrates claims that, well, it's incompatible with the recollection theory. The soul cannot be an epiphenomena of the body if the soul existed before the body. And also, if it is a harmony of the body, then the soul is a servant of the body. But by the authority of the divine Homer, this is wrong. Homer clearly shows in these lines from the Odyssey that it's the other way around. And this is kind of funny in the context of other writings of Plato on the authority of poets for your argument. We can come to that in the discussion later. After this, another big theme is introduced, the problem of generation and destruction. So this comes after a demand for a proof that the soul is indestructible and immortal. Socrates proposes to address this through an account of the cause of generation and decay. The cause of generation and decay. It's a big topic, right? Here Socrates also gives his case by telling a story of his intellectual journey. Now, I'll skip through some of this, but some of it's quite interesting. The grand Platonic theme, because it introduces the grand Platonic theme of the one and the many, the one and the many. How to get from one to many? How do things change and grow and differentiate? What is the principle of change, of growth, of generation? As an example of this, you can think perhaps of a seed when it grows and differentiates into a tree with bark and leaves and fruit and so on. Or an embryo, a single cell that then differentiates into the human body. What is the underlying principle of all change? In Platonism, the problem of generation of the many from the one comes down to how one becomes two. How difference is generated, how the same becomes other to itself. Now, there's two opposite ways of one becoming two. There's one added to two, where you just bring two ones together. But there's also division into two. One is separated from itself to generate two. And this is more what he has in mind when he's talking about generation. In this story, Socrates introduces another early philosopher. This is an account, true or mythical, we don't really know, of the transition of Socrates in his thinking to the theory of forms. And Plato's philosophy of noetic realms comes via Anaxagoras' own noetic or nous mind intelligence. Now, of Anaxagora, we only have a few fragments. It seems he was interested in the study of nature. He considered the mind, nous, controlled the universe, that there is a mixture of different stuffs of the universe, but not generation from one thing to another. It's all just a mixture. And so not very helpful for Socrates, for Socrates in his attempt to understand generation. Okay, so anyway, at first Socrates was excited by Anaxagoras, so he tells us in this story, that he might have the answers. It made sense to him that the mind arranged everything as is best, which was Anaxagoras' argument. He was expecting a physical theory on what is best for the universe to be. All would conform with the universal good. Was it the best for the earth to be round or flat? And so on. Now, as with a lot of this early science, this might sound really quite crazy, but it's often good to get a way to think about it that is not so crazy, and it kind of helps you come to terms with what's going on. So all for the best, what does it mean? Well, one way to imagine it in a useful way is to think of ferns growing in a cold, wet, shady valley, right? But they're really good at it, right? And that's for the best. Or lichen growing on a dry rock, right? It's the best at doing that. Everything has its niche. It is best for where it is. So that's one way of thinking about what he was going on about. So Socrates criticizes Anaxagoras in that he says that Anaxagoras said mind controls everything, but he doesn't follow through, deferring to physical cause instead of using mind nous to explain physical dynamics. So consider Socrates right now, talking in the prison. It's like Anaxagoras is saying that Socrates does what he does by not by using his mind, but he's there because his body and his sinews and everything are holding him there. It's a physical account. Instead, from Socrates' point of view, the operative reasoning here for why Socrates is sitting there is because he's been imprisoned by the state. Socrates chose to obey the rules. There's a psychosocial cause here that is more appropriate to explaining the situation. It seems that Socrates is saying that this is the sort of mind nous causation that Anaxagoras should be applying. So what's the problem? The problem is that Anaxagoras can't distinguish between a precondition for something to happen, the physical account, and the reason for it to happen, the psychosocial political cause for him sitting there, right? Socrates says that this is a common problem to call the precondition the cause. Now, we don't need to worry about definitions here because he explains it right away. To do so is not to look for the proximate power that causes a thing to be as it is, but to keep going for the underlying physical conditions to the underlying physical conditions and down and down and down to then the cause of the earth to being as it is, where it is. It sits on a vortex, it's on a fountain of air. Atlas is holding it up, and then who's holding up Atlas? A bigger Atlas, and so forth. It just goes on and on and on, and this does not help. And this reminds me of, I don't know whether people have heard that anecdote of a physicist giving a lecture, and an elderly lady comes up and says, well, you know, you know what's holding up the Earth? And the physicist says, what's that? She says, it's a turtle. And so the physicist then says, well, what's holding up the turtle? And she said, another turtle. And he asked her, well, what's holding up that? Well, you see, it's turtles all the way down. So she might think she has an answer, but Socrates doesn't. So Socrates sees no answer in this infinite regression. And this is what brings him, at least in this narrative, towards where he's heading. He's more interested in what holds everything together. So Socrates says he abandoned this path to solve the problems of causation and started to investigate conceptions, ideas, considering them as the truth behind physical reality. He starts an investigation of the underlying principles or laws that govern reality. And here we have a signal that the text is returning to our familiar topic of forms, which we'll consider next week, and especially the relation between sensible things and the forms and how things participate forms. But that's the end of our reading today. So if you've got any questions, comments, or reflections, let's hear them.
I found myself wondering whether the psychosocial cause and the precondition are completely separate. Because if you think of our psychological well-being, injuries caused in childhood affect the soul and the development of the soul and the intellect. And to a certain extent, you have to look after the business of the psychosocial, I think, in order then to turn your attention to the causation, to the precondition. And maybe he had done it, and maybe the society was different then, and they had done it naturally. But I think in our society, it's to turn the attention to the bigger being without focusing on the material world, material conditions, and I'm talking about traumatic conditions that affect the soul, is difficult. I mean, it would completely ruin psychotherapy, right, as a profession.
Are they kind of two different realms and then they interact? Is that how you see them? You know, the soul and the body, is that how you're seeing it? Or are you seeing?
I wasn't going there, but no. I think I understand. I think, you know, Socrates talks about putting your attention to the precondition and not worrying like he's in prison and he's in prison because of the society he lives in. And he was able to do that. But a lot of times if you're in prison, you can't really look at, you know, I don't know, maybe I don't believe enough, but to a certain extent, you need to look after the psychosocial in order to be able to then turn your attention. And he just turns his attention. So he's either dealt with that psychosocial, or he just overrides it and jumps over it. But is that possible for all of us?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. And I think, I think there is a more general formalistic side to it as well, which is really about a kind of, I think of little children asking a question and then going, why? And it just goes back and back and back. And I kind of think that this is what Anaxagoras was kind of doing, you know, like, and so you kind of, if you like, you might say it might be a bit like going back to the Big Bang or the singularity or whatever, you know, you kind of go back in physics towards there. And Socrates is saying, well, you know, it's the turtles or whatever. And Socrates is saying, well, actually, that's not really a good way to operate. A good way to operate is actually to look at the principles of knowledge and the laws of knowledge and the laws of physics or the laws of nature, to look at the underlying principles of what we know. And if we pay attention to those, then we can move forward. So I think that's the formal argument there. There is also a, you know, a specific argument between, if you like, between, you know, going straight for physics before you pay attention to this other stuff.
The physics is the realm of forms, right? Yeah. That's...
well, I think mathematics is the realm of forms. That's what I say to physicists. The mathematics is the realm of forms, and the physics is their expression or knowledge. You know, physics must, you know, when you're talking about physics, a physicist will always try to make their physics conform to the mathematics. If it doesn't conform to the mathematics, you know, it's a problem. And so the relationship between mathematics and physical theories or physical understandings of the world, right, is like the relationship between forms and the sensible world that Plato is trying to get across. So that's one way. That's another way to come to, you know, what is two? Maybe abandon that. If you're into maths and physics, that's another way to think about it, you know. But there can be different physics, as we know. There's revolutions in physics all the time, you know, down through history. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, can I throw something up completely unrelated? How do people find the challenge to Socrates by Echocrates? You know, where he said, well, you know, I was really convinced by the argument at first, and then now I've got these other arguments, and they've put them completely in doubt. And so, you know, what do I trust anymore? And then Socrates then saying, well, you know, there is good argument, but you don't want to have any sort of interest in the outcome and argue like a sophist. And then he says, well, I'm in that situation because I've got a huge interest in the outcome of this argument. So I just wonder how people found that section.
So maybe I misunderstood it, but I read that as he wanted to satisfy himself of the truth of an argument rather than to be swayed by the popular conclusion.
Yeah, well, he kind of said, like, I want to persuade myself. So if you like, when you're in the Senate and you're trying to get a bill passed, you want to persuade everyone else that this bill should be passed. In this case, he's saying, I want to persuade myself. I want to convince myself. But it's kind of similar. He actually says it's kind of similar situation to trying to persuade others. Yeah, you know, like I really want to believe that that I have an afterlife, that this isn't the absolute end. So I'm going to convince myself.
So was he saying he's seeking comfort more than the truth? He wants to feel comfortable that something is true, even if he can't explain it?
Yeah, well, it's interesting you say that, Paul, because later on he suggests that, yes, comfort. Yeah, he wants the comfort. And it doesn't matter if he dies, absolutely, because he's comforted while he's dying, and so are the people with him. But how does this, I mean, this kind of flips things up a bit onto another level, and maybe we don't want to go there exactly now, but what does that say about his entire argument through the whole dialogue for the immortality of the forms? When he said he's going for comfort.
Yeah, it's like he's running away from whatever the truth is.
That's what he's suggesting. That's what he's suggesting about himself. Socrates, the character in the dialogue. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. You know, it's complex because of course he's a character in the dialogue. It's a play. So what's Plato trying to say by all this?
Right.
I saw it the opposite. I saw it as acceptance and giving himself to it rather than running away. But it's just different interpretation, I guess.
Now we'll expand on that a bit, Effie. What do you mean by giving himself to it?
I don't know. It's the way I feel about, you know, even, you know, my own religious beliefs. Like I just give myself to them. It's not, you know, you just like relent. It's an acceptance. That's what I sensed when I was reading it. But
yeah, no. I think that's. I mean, in a way, I suppose what Paul's putting it in a fairly harsh way. You know, I suppose, and you know, and you're putting it in a softer way, I think. But you're really saying the same thing, I think.
I guess so. I was asking, is he in the end motivated by comfort, or is he motivated by an acceptance of truth through some sort of faith in the truth?
Yeah, well, I suppose that's the difference of views here. I mean, he's saying I'm almost as bad as they are, you know. So he's self-assessing himself. This is the thing. He's being self-critical. He's sort of saying, well, you know, it's a bit like when you're in a committee or something and you've got a vested interest, and usually you're removed from the committee. You know, sort of saying, well, maybe I should be removed from the committee because I got a vested interest here. But yeah, that's what he's saying, and then he continues on with the with making the case. What do you think of all this, Fiona?
When reading it, my mind, like, it kind of, it strayed into realms of like, with technology, will we be able to preserve our souls? And get to the real point of all this and find out actually what happens.
So how will technology find our souls?
Yes, and will it be possible to recreate a soul, or like also through AI and computing, which I think maybe Levi can talk to. But then also I was thinking about how when they were talking about the coats, how is art as if it's something that someone has made and it exists after you have died, is it like distilling, is it like a symbol of your soul, or like has an essence of the person who made it? And I was going to ask the question of like what these people thought of art as related. Was it part of the soul, or was it because of the muses? It was just the god who had visited you, so it wasn't you who made it.
Well, it might be an expression of the soul. I'm just thinking about what we read earlier about Socrates writing poetry. Remember that right at the beginning? Yeah.
True. I forgot about that.
But I'm interested when you're talking about the soul here. How are you viewing what the soul is at this stage? I mean, how are you viewing what Socrates is saying the soul is, or your view of the soul?
I am like I understand what Socrates is saying. I think and I feel I relate to it. in a way. I'm not like, I think it's not challenging me as much as some of the other ideas that we've been through. And I'm surprising myself, the immortality of the soul. I feel like I want to believe that the soul is immortal.
So does Socrates, as he says. Yeah.
So yeah, I think I'm leaning towards his views.
Yeah. Yeah. See, one way to see this is if you do pay maybe too much attention to this skepticism of the entire argument, which comes up here and comes up a bit later, is that it's not really about that argument. And the argument is just really stringing together the other content in the dialogue. And my analogy here, it's a bit like some of those old musicals, like by Cole Porter or someone, where like there's the narrative that strings together all the great songs that he's written, and then after a time, everyone forgets the narrative and just enjoys the songs. And in this way, I mean, what I see here is he's in the Phaedo, he's bringing up these big themes, like the big themes of Plato's philosophy are coming up and being introduced, like the songs. And he's kind of using the whole argument for immortality as a vehicle for it. So that's an extreme skeptical view, but it's one worth thinking about. I don't know.
And one last thing which also came to my mind, and I think it kind of relates to what Effie was talking about with was it psychosocial, or like and separating your, like, you don't have much control over, say, childhood trauma, and is that your body as the vessel for your soul, its reaction to the trauma, that's like your soul is just like the body is the mouthpiece for the soul, and maybe it's constraining the soul in a way, or like it was making me think about those sorts of concepts, and particularly like disabilities like MS or Parkinson's or something, where someone still can think and is can think and speak, but they can't, like their body is limiting them. So I was also thinking about that in a way. That's what this reading was making me.
It's there's definitely the body, the soul suffers in the body, right? And the soul suffers from things that happen through the body. So it suffers from its passions, it suffers from its pain, it suffers from all the bad things and good things and good and bad things that happen to it in that way. So there's definitely that discussion there. And so the idea is that no matter what situation you're in, whether you're in a really good situation or you have a great disability or you're poor or you're rich or whatever, the important thing is to remove yourself from that, because there's cyclic pleasure and pain, and you've got to remove yourself from that and go into the realm of the forms. And that is also your preparation for your death, whatever that is. Okay. So what does I'm wondering what everyone thinks about this whole idea of learning that's been brought up, and like the idea we haven't studied it, but this idea that Socrates will the slave boy will solve the mathematical problem without Socrates actually teaching him anything, just by helping and guiding him and asking him to ask his own questions. So it's kind of like, if you like, it's like an education theory where it comes from within. It's not like coming from the outside and being taught, but it's much more profound than that. It's really saying that you construct what you know from within in this way. And I just wonder if anyone have any reflections on that and feel like they get what he's talking about. What about you, Levi?
Could you repeat the question, please?
Oh, no, it's just this idea of learning as recollection. And so like it's all attached to this reincarnation thing, but we can forget that. It's just this idea that when you're born, right, you use the forms to construct your world, right? And so, he used the example of one of the examples he uses is where someone who is ignorant solves a mathematical problem from themselves. No one teaches them that. And then that's generalized to saying, well, no one actually teaches you in that sense anything. You learn it from within. You construct your knowledge from within. Can you kind of see what he's talking about there? I wonder. I'm just interested if anyone's getting any connection with that.
I've always felt, I don't know about the whole recollection aspect, but I certainly agree that there is something beyond mere language in the way we learn. For example, you might have a certain experience in a relation with a person, or you'll see a piece of artwork, and somehow that communicates something to you far easier than, say, a very dry book or detailed description of the thing. Whether or not it's coming from within or something within us is somehow grasping that form. But yeah, I certainly agree. I think that makes sense that we learn through the form of things, but I think it has to be through experience rather than explanation, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So what Plato's saying is that you see, if you like, examples or expressions of forms in complexity, of course. They're very complex. So you see expressions of forms in your experience, or you feel, or whatever, in your senses, and then in that way, you know the form that you remember, the form that you already know. That sort of thing. And what's related to what you're saying there, Paul, is like we're kind of getting there a bit, where I was saying, like, see what I mean when I'm talking about what is two. You see what I mean. Like, you can't prove it. You can't actually put it in words. You have to show someone two in order to get it. And this relates in a different way to the allegorical section of Plato's Republic, where he's trying to he's been pushed to explain what the higher truths are, the truths of forms in themselves, and then the form of all forms. And he says, look, I can't explain it in words. It's not even knowledge, it's beyond knowledge, because it's the form of knowledge. It's not even being, because it's the form of being. But what I can do, I can't explain it, is that I can show you its offspring, as he says, show you its offspring by giving you an allegory. And so that's when he goes into his allegories, one of which people might know, the allegory of the cave. So so it's very important for Plato, and I think you've probably seen it from presentation here, how it's presented here, that going beyond language is very important, and paying attention to the fact that in your knowledge does refer back beyond language. So when we were thinking about what is the definition of justice or the definition of something, you're actually got some idea or concept which is non-linguistic, and you're trying to put that into words. That's how Plato would see it.
The other thought I had was, does intuition play a role here? Because obviously you come across people that, for whatever reason, they just have an intuitive understanding about something, like music, for example, whereas other people will have to have it explained to them. But some people just sort of learn intuitively with certain things.
Yeah, well, that fits very well with Plato. Yes, definitely does. Yeah. All right. So, what else was I going to mention? Oh, I probably should just chat about the stuff with Homer. It's very strange in Plato because he's quoting Homer all the time. He's quoting, especially Homer, the poets, and he, in that case, he actually uses him as an authority. Well, Homer says this, so it must be true, which is kind of strange because what happens when you get to the Republic is that Plato says, well, actually, we don't want any of those stories. We don't want any poets or poetry in the Republic. And, in the dialogue, he's going, what? No poets. And so there's this interesting relation in Plato between this kind of love of Homer and love of the poets and love of the legends, but also being aware that people give too much attention to them, like as an authority on the correct way to do things, but also because the poets stir up the passions, and the poets present imagery and stuff, whereas you really should be turning your attention towards the forms and kind of turning in the other direction. So it's a funny sort of thing through Plato, and you can actually, I actually feel like I've kind of got to some sort of peace with it, because I can see what's going on here. But it's an interesting thing as you go on to read Plato. All right, anyone else? Maybe we'll finish early this week. I don't know, unless anyone's got any other questions or comments or something they want to bring up from other weeks. Come up.
Actually, I had a question about something you said earlier in the class.
Yeah.
We were talking about how we distinguish things from their opposite, or in context from their opposite.
Yeah.
The point, now, is it Plato making that point, or is it Socrates?
Oh, we distinguish things from their opposites. Well, it's Plato. Let's just say it's Plato. Yeah.
Yeah, is the point, is he just making an observation about the world, or is he, because it seems to me that distinction points to something about ourselves as well, in terms of our nature to choose between things. We're just making an observation about how things are.
Okay, so let me go to that question in this way. So
Can you just repeat the question? I haven't quite got my head around it. Sorry.
Right.
I was asking, is the observation that a thing in the world is distinguished from its opposite, does that somehow point to our own nature? Or is the point he's just making an observation about how the world is? Because it seems like we can distinguish between things because we can choose between them.
Okay, so the answer I want to give, Paul, is to try to show how the question is pointing away from the Platonic view, and this is our problem in coming to it. So in the materialistic view, you've got the world out there, right? And then and it's a world of objects and things, right? All pre-distinguished, and then we have a relationship with them. Okay, so there's this kind of the idea and the thing itself, which is external. Now, in Plato, as I've been trying to show through the exercise and so on, he has this crazy mad, right? I mean, to our way of thinking, a pretty crazy way of thinking is that the object is not external in that sense. So it's internal, right? It's fully internal. So when you're asking a question about ourselves and the object, you're asking about the same thing. So it's not this distinction between inside and outside there. And so it all comes back to the forms. And what you were describing there is an elementary aspect of the formal nature of things. So for Plato, and we'll get this later, so in a way I'm kind of, in a way what I'm doing here in this class, I suppose, is it is here in the Phaedo, but in those exercises and stuff, you've got to read Parmenides and the Sophist and some of the later dialogues to really get where he really hones in on this same other thing, the opposite stuff, right? It comes up later. So, in the exercises, I'm just trying to land you in there now. But this same other thing is form. Now, if we're understanding what form is, then there is your answer. So remember, the essence of things is like the essence of number. Form exists where number exists, number in itself, or perfect circle. When we see a wheel that's bent, we say it's not a perfect circle. What are you referring to? The ideal circle. Where does that exist? Where does two exist? All that sort of thing. So it's all coming back to that and moving away from this idea of observer and observed, where the observed are pre-distinguished things external to the observer. That's tough, but think about that. Is that helpful at all, or just more confusing?
Yeah, I think so. I guess I was thinking about your example of the island and the sea.
Yes.
So the thing only exists in distinction to its opposite. So if you take something like justice and injustice, we only recognize justice because we also recognize injustice.
Yes, that's right.
But an animal never could make that distinction. So does that somehow point to something about ourselves, I guess was the question.
So when you say an animal could never make the distinction of justice, injustice, is that what you're saying?
Correct. Yep.
Yeah. Well, an animal can make the distinction between, I don't know, between a rat and a mouse, or a porcupine and a cat or something. So the animal, in our theories of animal perception, we would see how the animal in the same way makes distinctions in their experience. So the animal potentially could be doing the same thing from birth as the baby human does, making distinctions. So one of the first distinction that the baby makes, the same as the animal, is not I, makes a distinction which gives them their world, and then makes distinctions in their experience of their experience to generate their world. Right. So it's all internal. It's all self-referencing and internal. Yeah. Yeah. So speculating about whether an animal has a concept of justice or not. Yeah, I don't know whether we need to do that. Yeah. Okay. All right. So any other questions around that? I mean, on that thing about making distinctions, people find it helpful, that example of where I was talking about going to Aunt Agatha's farm and all the chickens look the same, and then after 2 weeks, and she's given them all names, and then after 2 weeks, all the names, and of course they look different. How your experience in some ways has not changed, but in other ways it has changed because you've distinguished between the different chickens. And I mean, in learning something, maybe even learning a language where you just hear all the sounds and it's just a wall of sound. And then after a while, you're distinguishing and distinguishing. So nothing's changed in some ways in your experience. You're still hearing the same noise, right? You're still seeing the same chickens, right? You're still experiencing that. But your experience has actually changed. In a way, your world has changed. So do other people have examples like that they can relate? Someone in another class when COVID started said, oh, you know, like I used to recognize everyone by their faces, and then I couldn't recognize everyone because they were all wearing masks at work. But then I started recognizing everyone by their eyes. It took a while, but I started doing it. I couldn't do it at first, but then I could. And I don't know whether anyone's got any other experiences like that they can relate, where your experience actually changes from learning like that by making distinctions. That's another way to Plato.
What I thought was, if Plato's books are the farm and his ideas are the chickens, the more time I spend there, maybe one day I can distinguish between the chickens. I'll get to know them.
Yes, right, okay. Yes, he's all these different ideas of the chickens. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. All right. Okay, well, look, let's wind it up then. Now, next week is our final week, so we'll bring along a tipple of your choice for the last section of that, and we're going to go back into the theory of forms, look at this opposites, generation from opposites, and participation. So the same sort of stuff that we're talking about tonight, and then we will also get to the dramatic end of the story, where Socrates is preparing to die and his last words and taking the hemlock. So we'll finish off with that sad ending. Yeah, okay. And if there's no other questions, then have a good week and we'll see you next time. Okay. Our
Thank you.
final session.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.